Imagine it is March 15th, 2019. You're a 34-year-old software developer living in Austin, Texas. You have just opened an email from your company's HR department, and your hands are slightly shaking. Not from fear, from excitement. You have just received your third promotion in 5 years, and your salary is jumping from $95,000 a year to $130,000 a year. That is a 37% raise. You sit back in your chair and exhale. You think about your apartment, the one-bedroom unit you have been renting for $200 a month. You think about your 7-year-old Honda Civic. You think about the $4,000 sitting in your savings account. And for the first time in your adult life, you feel like you are about to get ahead. You feel like the pressure is finally going to ease. You feel like the math of your life is about to change forever. If you have ever wondered why so many people earn more and more every year but never actually feel wealthier, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before, across countries, across centuries, and across every income level you can imagine. And it always ends the same way. The raise disappears. Not because someone stole it, but because something far quieter consumed it. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now let me tell you what happened to that software developer in Austin. Within 6 months of that promotion, he moved into a 2-bedroom apartment for $200 a month. He leased a new BMW 3 Series for $489 a month. He upgraded his phone, planned, started eating out 4 or 5 nights a week, bought a Peloton bike, and signed up for 3 new streaming services. By December of that same year, 9 months after a $35,000 raise, he had less money in his savings account than he did before the promotion. Not because he was irresponsible, not because he was foolish, but because he did what almost every human being does when their income rises. He expanded his life to fill the new money. Economists have a term for this. They call it lifestyle inflation, which simply means that when people earn more, they tend to spend more almost automatically, so that their actual financial position barely changes or sometimes even gets worse. And this is not just a modern problem. This is not just an American problem. This is a pattern so deeply wired into human behavior and economic systems that it has been quietly destroying wealth for centuries. That is what this video is about, not a lecture about budgeting, not a finger-wagging sermon about spending too much on coffee. This is a deep look at how lifestyle inflation works as a mechanism, how it has played out across history, and why it is one of the most powerful and least understood forces that keeps people trapped, no matter how much they earn. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about the basic machinery of lifestyle inflation. Most people think of their financial life as a simple equation. Money comes in, money goes out. If more money comes in, you should have more left over. That math seems obvious, but it ignores the most powerful variable in the equation, which is human psychology. When your income rises, something shifts inside your brain. Researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research found in a 2006 study that the human brain processes a raise not as an opportunity to save, but as a signal to upgrade. Your reference point changes. The apartment that felt fine last month suddenly feels cramped. The car that got you to work just fine now seems embarrassing when you pull into the parking lot next to your new peers. You do not consciously decide to waste the raise. You unconsciously recalibrate what you believe you need. Think of it like a thermostat. When you set a thermostat to 72 degrees, the system does not just heat the room and stop. It constantly adjusts. If the room gets too cool, the heat kicks on. If it gets too warm, the system pulls back. Your spending works exactly the same way. When your income rises, your internal thermostat resets to a higher number, and your spending automatically adjusts upward to match, keeping you at the same level of financial tension you had before. The raise did not remove the pressure. It just moved the pressure to a higher altitude. This is the core mechanism, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It explains why a family earning $250,000 a year can feel just as financially stressed as a family earning $60,000. It explains why lottery winners go broke, and it explains why entire nations, not just individuals, have fallen into this trap across history. This brings us directly to the first major case study, and it begins in a place most people would never associate with lifestyle inflation. Post-World War II America, specifically the years between 1945 and 1965, is remembered as a golden age. Soldiers came home. The economy boomed. Wages rose dramatically. The median household income in the United States roughly doubled in real terms during this period, going from about $3,800 in 1947 to around $6,900 by 1965, adjusted for inflation. Americans had never been richer, and yet something strange was happening beneath the surface. The personal savings rate, which had been extraordinarily high during the war years, around 25% of income, began to drop steadily. By the mid-1950s, it was hovering around 10%. By the 1960s, it was falling further, and consumer debt was exploding. Between 1945 and 1960, total consumer credit in the United States went from about $5.7 billion to over $56 billion. That is nearly a tenfold increase in just 15 years. What happened was textbook lifestyle inflation on a national scale. As wages rose, Americans did not save the difference. They moved to the suburbs, they bought bigger houses, they filled those houses with brand new appliances, televisions, washing machines, and second cars. The two-car garage became standard not because families needed two cars, but because families earning more money felt they deserved two cars. William Levitt, the builder behind Levittown, the most famous post-war suburb on Long Island, understood this mechanism perfectly. He offered affordable homes with modern kitchens, specifically designed to make families feel they were stepping up in the world. And step up they did. The average new American home grew from about 983 square feet in 1950 to around 1,500 square feet by 1970. Families were earning more, but they were also spending more and often borrowing to do it. The individual worker in 1955 who got a significant raise did not use it to build a financial cushion. He used it to buy a house in the suburbs, finance a new Chevrolet, and keep up with his neighbors who were doing the exact same thing. By the time the economic turbulence of the 1970s hit, with oil shocks and stagflation, which means the economy stagnating while prices rise at the same time, millions of these families had almost no financial buffer. They had earned more than any generation in history, and they had almost nothing to show for it. The raises were real. The wealth was not, because lifestyle inflation had quietly absorbed every single dollar of progress. This leads us to the second part of this story, a very different country in a very different era. But first, here is something I want you to think about before we go further. How much more do you earn today compared to 5 years ago? And honestly, do you feel 5 years wealthier? Do you have 5 years worth of extra savings, extra investments, extra security? Or did the money just kind of vanish into a slightly nicer version of the same life? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. In 1985, Japan was entering what would later be called the bubble economy. Japanese workers, particularly those in finance, real estate, and manufacturing, were seeing their incomes rise at rates that seemed almost miraculous. Between 1985 and 1989, the average Japanese household's financial assets grew by over 50%. The Nikkei stock index, which tracks the value of major Japanese companies, quadrupled during the 1980s. Real estate prices in Tokyo became so inflated that, at one point in 1989, the land beneath the Imperial Palace was estimated to be worth more than the entire state of California. Japanese salarymen, the name given to white-collar office workers, were suddenly flush with cash. And what did they do? They inflated their lifestyles at a breathtaking pace. Luxury goods became a national obsession. By 1990, Japan accounted for nearly 30% of the global luxury goods market. Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Chanel, all of them saw Japan as their most important growth market. A generation of workers who had grown up in modest post-war conditions suddenly found themselves buying designer clothing, taking lavish vacations to Hawaii and Europe, dining at expensive restaurants, and moving into more expensive apartments in central Tokyo. The concept of keeping up with the Joneses, which in Japan might be called keeping up with the Tanakas, reached fever pitch. A young banker named Takeshi Yamamoto, profiled in a 1991 New York Times article about Japan's newly rich, described how his salary had tripled in 4 years, and how he had immediately upgraded his apartment, his car, and his wardrobe to match his new status. He said something that perfectly captures the psychology of lifestyle inflation. He said, "I did not feel richer. I just felt normal at a higher level." And that phrase is everything. Feeling normal at a higher level. That is the thermostat resetting. That is the mechanism at work. And then the bubble burst. In January 1990, the Nikkei began its catastrophic decline, eventually losing nearly 80% of its value over the following decade. Real estate prices in Tokyo fell by as much as 90% in some areas. Japan entered what economists now call the lost decade, which actually lasted closer to 2 decades, a prolonged period of economic stagnation that stretched from 1991 to at least 2010. And those salarymen who had inflated their lifestyles to match their bubble era incomes were devastated. Their salaries were cut, their bonuses vanished, but their expenses, the rent on the nicer apartment, the payments on the luxury car, the lifestyle they had built, those did not shrink as easily. Lifestyle inflation is like a ratchet. A ratchet is a tool that turns in one direction and locks, making it very difficult to turn back. Spending goes up easily, but it almost never comes back down without pain. Now here is where it gets interesting, because this same pattern shows up in an entirely different context in a country on the other side of the world decades later. In the early 2000s, Ireland experienced one of the most dramatic economic booms in European D of extraordinary GDP growth that ran from roughly 1995 to 2007. During this period, Ireland's GDP per capita nearly tripled. Average industrial earnings rose by over 60% in real terms. Unemployment fell from over 15% in the early 1990s to under 4% by 2001. Ireland went from being one of Western Europe's poorest countries to one of its richest in barely a decade. And the Irish people, understandably, began to spend. Between 2000 and 2007, Irish household debt more than tripled, rising from approximately 48 billion euros to over 150 billion euros. Property prices in Dublin doubled and then doubled again. A 3-bedroom, semi-detached house in a middle-class Dublin neighborhood that might have cost 100,000 euros in 1995 was selling for over 400,000 euros by 2006. Young professionals who landed good jobs in tech, pharmaceuticals, or financial services saw their incomes rise rapidly, and they immediately translated those incomes into bigger mortgages and newer cars, foreign holidays, and renovated kitchens. The cultural pressure was immense. In a small country where everyone knows everyone, visible signs of success mattered enormously. A 2006 survey by the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin found that Irish households were spending 104% of their disposable income. That means, on average, Irish families were spending more than they earned, covering the difference with borrowing. They were not saving any of their raises. They were spending beyond their raises. Lifestyle inflation had gone past 100%. It had become lifestyle borrowing. And then 2008 arrived. The global financial crisis hit Ireland harder than almost any other developed country. Property prices collapsed by over 50%. Unemployment surged back to nearly 15%. The government was forced to accept an 85 billion euro bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. Entire neighborhoods of newly built houses stood empty. Negative equity, which means owing more on your mortgage than your home is actually worth, affected an estimated 37% of Irish mortgage holders by 2012. A generation that had experienced nothing but rising incomes suddenly found themselves trapped. Their lifestyles had expanded to fit the boom. But when the boom ended, the lifestyles did not shrink. The loans were still due. The mortgage payments were still required. The car leases were still running. The Celtic Tiger had given Ireland enormous raises. And lifestyle inflation had eaten every single one. Negative equity, which means owing more on your mortgage than your home is actually worth, affected an estimated 37% of Irish mortgage holders by 2012. A generation that had experienced nothing but rising incomes suddenly found themselves trapped. Their lifestyles had expanded to fit the boom, but when the boom ended, the lifestyles did not shrink. The loans were still due, the mortgage payments were still required, the car leases were still running. The Celtic Tiger had given Ireland enormous raises, and lifestyle inflation had eaten every single one. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep chasing raises, promotions, and salary bumps, believing each one will finally be the one that puts them ahead. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together: America after World War II, Japan in the late 1980s, Ireland in the 2000s, 3 different countries, 3 different decades, 3 different cultures, and yet the mechanism was identical every single time. Incomes rose dramatically. People felt wealthier. They upgraded their lives to match. Their expenses rose to meet and often exceed their new income. Their savings rate stayed flat or declined, and when the economic environment eventually shifted, as it always does, they were more vulnerable than they had been before the boom started. The raise did not protect them. The raise, paradoxically, endangered them because it gave them not a cushion, but a higher cliff to fall from. This is the part that makes lifestyle inflation so dangerous and so misunderstood. It does not feel like a problem while it is happening. It feels like success. It feels like progress. The new apartment feels earned. The better car feels deserved. The nicer restaurants feel like a natural reward for hard work. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to sabotage their financial future. They just slowly, automatically, imperceptibly adjust their standard of living upward with each pay increase, each bonus, each promotion. And over time, the gap between what they earn and what they need to survive stays exactly the same, or it gets worse. A 2019 study by the Federal Reserve found that nearly 40% of American adults could not cover an unexpected $400 expense without borrowing or selling something. This included people earning well above the median income, people making $75,000, $100,000, even $150,000 a year. They were not poor, they were inflated. Their lifestyles had expanded to consume everything. The floor they were standing on looked solid, but the foundation was hollow. because the money was flowing through them, not accumulating beneath them, like water running through open fingers instead of filling a cup. And this is where history gets uncomfortable, because the people who get hurt the most by lifestyle inflation are not the ones you might expect. It is not the very poor. The very poor, tragically, often do not have enough income to inflate. Their survival expenses consume everything. And it is not the very rich. The truly wealthy often have assets, investments, real estate portfolios, and family trusts that generate income regardless of their spending habits. The people who suffer most from lifestyle inflation are the middle class and the upper middle class, the professionals, the managers, the doctors, lawyers, engineers, and mid-level executives who work hard, earn decent salaries, and slowly ratchet their spending up with every career milestone. These are the people who look successful from the outside but are financially fragile on the inside. History is full of them. In the United States, after the 2008 financial crisis, some of the most devastating foreclosure rates were not in the poorest neighborhoods. They were in newly built suburban developments, full of 4-bedroom houses with granite countertops and 3-car garages. These were homes bought by families earning $120,000 or $150,000 a year, who had taken on mortgages they could technically afford as long as nothing went wrong. When layoffs came, when bonuses disappeared, when the housing market collapsed, these families were more exposed than anyone. A family earning $40,000 in a modest apartment with no car payment and $2,000 in savings had almost nothing to lose. A family earning $150,000 with a $3,500 mortgage, 2 car leases, private school tuition, and $800 in checking was one missed paycheck away from catastrophe. And that is exactly what lifestyle inflation does. It converts high income into high vulnerability. It transforms, raises into obligations. It turns every dollar of progress into a dollar of commitment. The people who walked away from 2008 in the strongest position were not always the highest earners. They were the people whose spending had stayed well below their income for years, who had been building a gap between what they made and what they spent, and who had used that gap to accumulate assets that held value during the downturn. The survivors were not people who never got raises. They were people whose raises went into investments instead of upgrades. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods of economic disruption largely shared 3 characteristics. First, they maintained a consistent gap between their income and their spending regardless of how much their income grew. This did not mean they lived in deprivation. It meant that when they got a 20% raise, they might increase their spending by 5% and direct the other 15% into savings or investments. They enjoyed some of the increase, but they did not let the thermostat reset completely. Second, they avoided lifestyle commitments that were difficult to reverse. There's a critical difference between buying a nicer dinner and signing a 48-month car lease. The dinner is a one-time expense. The lease is a fixed obligation that persists whether your income stays high or not. The people who survived downturns tended to have fewer fixed obligations relative to their income. Their lives could flex downward without breaking. They had built shock absorbers into their financial structure. Third, and this is perhaps the most counterintuitive characteristic, they were comfortable being visibly below their means. In every boom period in history, there's enormous social pressure to display your success. In post-war America, it was the house in the suburbs. In bubble-era Japan, it was the designer label. In Celtic Tiger Ireland, it was the investment property. In Bulgaria or Spain, the survivors were the ones who resisted that pressure, not because they were smarter, but because they understood, consciously or instinctively, that visible wealth and actual wealth are not the same thing. In fact, they're often opposites. The family driving the modest car and living in the smaller house while earning a high salary was building real wealth. The family in the brand new SUV and the oversized house was building an illusion. The American Millionaire Study conducted by Thomas Stanley and William Danko, published in their 1996 book, The Millionaire Next Door, found that the majority of American millionaires drove used cars, lived in modest homes, and had never purchased a suit costing more than $400. They had high incomes and low lifestyles. They had never allowed their internal thermostat to reset. And that single habit, more than any investment strategy or stock pick, was the primary reason they had accumulated wealth. They did not outperform the market. They outperformed their own impulses. Now, let me bring you back to Austin, Texas, and that 34-year-old software developer. Remember him? The one who opened that email in March 2019 and felt for the first time like he was finally going to get ahead? By the end of 2019, he had increased his monthly expenses by nearly $2,800. His rent was up by $900. His car payment was up by $489. His food spending had doubled. His subscriptions and memberships added another $300 a month. He was earning $35,000 more per year, but saving less than he had before. And then March 2020 arrived. The pandemic hit. His company cut salaries by 15%. Suddenly, he was earning less than his new lifestyle required. He could not easily break his apartment lease. He could not return the BMW without a hefty penalty. He could not undo the lifestyle inflation overnight. And so he did what millions of Americans did that year. He put expenses on credit cards. His credit card balance, which had been zero before the promotion, climbed to over $14,000 by the end of 2020. The promotion that was supposed to change his financial life had, within 18 months, actually made it worse. He earned more. He owed more. He saved less. And he felt more stressed about money than he ever had at $95,000 a year. He was not a cautionary tale about reckless spending. He was a perfectly normal human being responding to a perfectly normal raise in a perfectly normal way. That is what makes lifestyle inflation so dangerous. It does not require stupidity. It does not require greed. It only requires being human. It only requires that subtle, invisible recalibration that happens every time the number on your paycheck goes up. The pattern is as old as money itself. Roman senators in the first century complained about the rising spending of the newly wealthy merchant class, who expanded their households, their wardrobes, and their banquets every time their trade profits increased. The sumptuary laws of medieval Europe, which were rules that tried to restrict what different social classes were allowed to buy, existed precisely because people at every level of society were inflating their lifestyles the moment they had more income. The mechanism never changes. The technology changes, the country changes, the currency changes, but the human software running underneath it all stays the same. Every raise feels like a new beginning, and every raise gets consumed by the same quiet process. The thermostat resets, the spending adjusts. The gap between income and expenses stays painfully thin. And the next disruption, whatever form it takes, finds you just as vulnerable as you were before. Today, this pattern is arguably more powerful than it has ever been. Modern consumer culture, targeted digital advertising, same-day delivery, buy now pay later financing, and social media platforms that showcase the lifestyles of others have created an environment perfectly engineered to accelerate lifestyle inflation. A 2023 report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics found that American households earning between $100,000 and $150,000 a year spent, on average, 95% of their after-tax income. Their savings rate was barely 5%, the same as households earning half as much. The raises were flowing. The lifestyle inflation was consuming them in real time. And the financial vulnerability of the American middle class, despite decades of rising nominal incomes, remains stubbornly, dangerously high. History does not predict the future, but it does reveal the machinery. And the machinery of lifestyle inflation is running right now in every city, in every income bracket, in every country where incomes are rising and spending is rising faster. The floor looks solid, but the cracks are there. They are always there. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. They will close the tab and go back to browsing the next thing they want to buy. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.